Hi, this is MPeck, and I'm choosing Skeeter for my character to do an analysis on from the book The Help by Catherine Stockett. So I feel like Skeeter, between Aibileen and Minnie and Skeeter, had the most dramatic character arc change. Um, Aibileen and Minnie obviously changed a bunch, but their changes were a lot more intrinsic and internal, whereas Skeeter her whole everything about her changed, and it was very easy for other characters to see as well as herself. Um, in the beginning of the book, she's very self centered, she's very selfishly motivated as to why she's doing things. So, like for example, her motivation to write the book Help was in order to get the job in New York City and was to impress Miss Stein. The whole reason she even picked the topic of African American maids in Mississippi was to impress Miss Stein. It was that kind of shock value. I think I remember Miss Stein was like, "Oh, pick something with civil rights that's popular right now." It was for that. And then she used Aibileen for the Miss Myrna column. She was kind of passing these answers off as her own, which she did feel bad about. But then at the end of the book, when she gave the Miss Myrna column to Aibileen and kind of fought at the newspaper to give Aibileen that position, I feel like that was really representative of kind of her giving and becoming more of a selfless person. As well as with the book, so while she did start out with selfish motivations, it definitely changed throughout that. She became very invested in the book. She was very invested in its publication. And even, Minnie and Aibileen were constantly warning her of all these repercussions that could happen, and Skeeter still kept writing this book and kept pushing for it to be published. Another way she developed was with her friends. So at the beginning of the book, she was best friends with Hilly and Elizabeth. She mentioned, how close they were, that her and Hilly were sorority sisters and roommates back in college. And these are the people kind of that she looked up to. They were her best friends. They had, the club together. She had that big role as the newspaper editor of the club. And then throughout the book, they slowly kind of drift apart and apart and apart, and you can really see how as Skeeter grows, Hilly and Elizabeth kind of hang back, and they become kind of like a benchmark, as you can see how Skeeter grows apart from them is how much her character is growing as well, if that makes sense. Um, and then her attitude towards Constantine, I feel like that's another big kind of indicator of how she grew as a person. In the beginning of the book, obviously she loves Constantine throughout this whole book. And in the beginning, she's very much trying to find out what happened to her. She's, asking her mother all these things, but her motivations for that are a little bit more selfish. It's because she loved Constantine as a figure in her life, and she had never kind of considered that Constantine could be anything other than an extension of Skeeter's own life, in a way, if that makes sense. But then when she learns about Constantine's daughter, Constantine's old life, that she was moving back to Chicago, all of these things, she starts thinking of Constantine as a real person and not just as her caretaker or as her second mother. Like towards the end of the book, she was, wondering all of these things about Constantine's life before Skeeter's own family. Another indicator was getting over Stuart. At the beginning of the book, she's very excited that Stuart is kind of into her. She's very much leaning into this new relationship with Stuart. She spends a whole lot of time with him. She's wanting to impress his family, things like that. But then throughout the book, she like doesn't need his approval as much, and she doesn't feel the need to have a boyfriend or to be with Stuart. And when they finally, break up for the last time and drift their separate ways, end the engagement, things like that, and she tells him the truth, that's another kind of indicator, because past Skeeter would have just been happy that someone was interested in her and that she had a boyfriend and that her mother could, fixate on that instead of on Skeeter's issues, things like that. But she kind of grew up from that. She grew apart from that. Even physically, she changed as a character. Towards the end of the book, she grew her hair long and kind of embraced modernity. She wore like her short dresses, things like that. I remember Aibileen had said towards the end of the book, like, "Oh, this northern woman was here, blah blah," but it was just Skeeter. So that's another way that her character developed. She didn't necessarily hold herself back to Mississippi's like clothing standards or standards of how you should look. She was kind of doing her own thing instead. And then with her mother, in the beginning of the book, her mother is very critical of Skeeter and things like that, and Skeeter, it gets to her. You know, she cares about that. And while she definitely still cares what her mother thinks of her towards the end of the book, their relationship changed a whole lot, especially with her mother's cancer. Skeeter became more of a caretaker, and she loved her mother, but she could realize kind of where her mother had gone wrong, especially when she learned about what happened with Constantine. That really kind of was a big change for her. And then lastly, another like big character arc thing for her was moving to New York City. You know, at the beginning of the book, she wanted to move to New York City and all this, but she couldn't get the job. And then when she finally got the job, she really considered staying back in Mississippi with Minnie and Aibileen and all of the other maids to kind of stand with them. And then they convinced her to move. And I feel like that ending really represents how her character as a whole completely changed and moved on from kind of her past situation and how she grew up. So yeah, that's it.